Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions. Would ask those here in-house to make that last check, as many of our panelists are doing, to see that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. We will, of course, post the program on the Heritage homepage following today's presentations for your future reference. And our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. Hosting our program is Jim Phillips. Mr. Phillips is Senior Research Fellow for Middle East Affairs in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. He is a veteran foreign policy specialist who has written widely on Middle Eastern issues and international terrorism since coming here to Heritage in 1979. He has authored dozens of papers on Iran, its nuclear program and use of terrorism, and has testified before Congress on Iran's nuclear program and other Middle East security issues. Please join me in welcoming Jim Phillips. Jim?
Thanks, John. And thank you, you hardy few who showed up in a very cold day. Yesterday, the final push for a nuclear agreement with Iran and the P5+1 powers started in Vienna ahead of the self-imposed November 24th deadline. The conventional wisdom is that the deadline will be extended again as it was last July. Iran has dug in and is taken a very hard line, refusing to dismantle its uranium enrichment program and other aspects of its nuclear infrastructure. But yesterday there was a report in the LA Times about a possible midnight surprise. So hold on to your hats this weekend. There's a danger that the Obama administration, in a rush to salvage a foreign policy legacy, may sign off on a risky deal with a regime a risky agreement in principle with the regime that has no principles except for staying in power and exporting its Islamist revolution. Today we'll focus on some of the potential problems of the talks and prospects for attaining a successful resolution that would advance U.S. national interests. We're fortunate to have with us three leading experts who can shed light on these questions. Our first speaker will be Fred Fleitz. Fred worked in national security positions for 25 years at the CIA, the DIA, the State Department, and the House Intelligence Committee. From 2001 to 2005, he was a senior advisor and chief of staff to Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, John Bolton. In 2011, he founded the Langley Intelligence Group Network, which is an online forecasting and analysis service. Since November 2013, he's been a senior fellow with the Center for Security Policy, where he specializes in the threat from radical Islam, the Iran nuclear program, and issues related to the Snowden leaks and NSA reform. Our second speaker, Patrick Clawson, is the author or editor of 18 studies on Iran, mostly about Iranian foreign policy and economics. He's a scholar of Iranian history and is fluent in Persian. His most recent co-authored book is the History of Money. Actually, I have another group.
You want the black one.
The history of, well, this is an interesting topic. The History of Money in Iran from 1500 to 1925, with footnotes in 6 languages. And I hope you went into the Iran's, during Ahmadinejad's time, Iran came out with a new note that had the atom on it. So that would be an interesting addendum to your book. But his even more recent is this book on how Iranians might react to a nuclear deal, trying to get into the head of Iranian policymakers and in a very fractured policy-making environment. Patrick's been an expert witness in more than 30 court cases against Iran for its state sponsorship of terrorism. Currently, he's the director of research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Previously, he was a senior economist at the National Defense University, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. And then our last speaker will be Henry Sokolski. He's the executive director of the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center and teaches at the Institute of World Politics here in Washington. He served at the Pentagon as a deputy for non-proliferation policy, as a full-time consultant to the Secretary of Defense's Office of Net Assessment, and as a consultant to the National Intelligence Council. He was a member of the CIA's Senior Advisory Group and a Senate legislative aide on nuclear energy and military affairs. He was appointed to the Commission on the Prevention of WMD Proliferation and Terrorism and the Deutsche WMD Proliferation Commission. And he's authored and edited numerous volumes on strategic weapons proliferation issues, including his most recent one, and I hope I get this right, Underestimated, Our Not So Peaceful Nuclear Future. Also, he wrote Best of Intentions, America's Campaign Against Strategic Weapons Proliferation. And with that, let's kick off with Fred.
Thanks, Jim. I'd like to thank the Heritage Foundation and you, Jim, for inviting me here again to talk about this issue. It's hard to believe we were here just a year ago discussing the interim deal that set off this year's talks on a final agreement to address concerns about the Iranian nuclear program. Well, a final round before a November 24th deadline has begun in Vienna to try to get an agreement between Iran and the P5+6 countries. U.S. officials say there are some significant differences between the two sides. They're trying to bridge these differences. Secretary Kerry will be in Vienna later this week to try to see what he can do to get an agreement before the 24th of November. The Iranians have insisted that they will not agree to excessive demands to get an agreement. It's pretty clear this agreement is extremely important to the Obama administration. In fact, Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes said earlier this year to a group of interest groups at the White House that this agreement was similar to health care. Frankly, in the second term, this is the Obama administration's Obamacare. It is that important to them. Some people are saying that a nuclear deal with Iran is too big to fail, and not getting a deal would be simply catastrophic. There has to be a deal. I want to step back and talk about how we got to where we are and what's really on the table. Now, to get to where we are, the United States had to make some extraordinary concessions. We agreed to allow Iran last November to continue to enrich uranium. We essentially conceded to Iran the right to enrich uranium. This reversed years of U.S. policy on the Iranian nuclear program. We stopped calling for Iran to disassemble centrifuges. We did not call for Iran to get rid of its large reactor-grade uranium stockpile. And if it enriched the stockpile to weapons grade, they could make right now at least 8 nuclear weapons, maybe more. We did not insist that Iran stop construction of the Iraq heavy water reactor, which will be a source of plutonium when it is completed. Iran did agree to some things last November. They agreed to stop enriching uranium to the 20% level. Now, according to Obama officials, this was a significant concession because 20% enriched uranium, they claim, is much more dangerous than reactor grade. Not true. Not true. It only will take about 2 weeks longer to make weapons-grade uranium out of reactor grade than 20%. Iran also agreed that any uranium enriched beyond its current stockpile of reactor-grade uranium would be converted into uranium dioxide. Again, the claim was this was a significant concession by Iran because it would take much longer to make enriched uranium in the form of uranium dioxide into weapons-grade uranium. Also, not true. 2 weeks. It would take only 2 weeks to convert uranium dioxide back into uranium hexafluoride to further enrich to weapons grade. So these were inconsequential, easily reversible concessions made by Iran to get them to the negotiating table. We asked Iran to stop installing and testing advanced centrifuges in the interim agreement last fall. However, before the talks began early this year, it turned out Iran had installed advanced centrifuges, and this delayed the talks. So we came up with a compromise. Iran could experiment with certain advanced centrifuges, but could not test them with uranium. They could not insert uranium hexafluoride into these centrifuges. This month, the IAEA said in a report that Iran has tested advanced centrifuges and has inserted uranium hexafluoride into them. Iran cheated on the deal while the talks were underway. We also got Iran to agree last year that they would cooperate with the IAEA. They would allow IAEA inspectors access to nuclear facilities. They would answer outstanding questions about their nuclear program. Iran has not abided by any of these conditions. For example, there's a plant called Parchin where Iran is believed to have conducted experiments to construct a nuclear warhead. They will not let the IAEA access to this facility, and according to satellite imagery, efforts have been made to sanitize this facility to hide evidence of weapons-related work. So the question remains, how can we trust Iran to abide by a final agreement? How can the IAEA verify a final agreement when Iran cheated during the talks? One other issue I want to add, there's a sunset clause we agreed to last November. This will be a temporary agreement. Iran wants it to last less than 10 years. The Obama administration is saying double digits. That means after the agreement expires, Iran will be treated as a normal nuclear state. They will be allowed to build as many centrifuges, as many plutonium-producing heavy water reactors as they wish, as long as they inform the IAEA. So what's happened since the deal? The situation has gotten worse. We've seen proposals by the Obama administration to allow Iran to have 1,500, 4,500, 6,000, maybe 8,000 centrifuges. That might be the surprise Jim was talking about. This is troublesome for several reasons. The argument is that if we allow Iran to have less centrifuges, that will significantly decrease their capability to make weapons-grade fuel. The problem is they have an enormous stockpile of reactor-grade uranium. And since the enrichment of uranium is nonlinear, meaning most of the work is done early in the process, you don't need as many centrifuges to make weapons-grade uranium when you start from reactor-grade. With 1,500 centrifuges, that is more than enough for Iran to make a nuclear weapon in 2.2 to 3.5 months. And this is using a fairly conservative estimate on the output of these centrifuges. And my colleague Henry Sokolski knows more about SWUs and that kind of thing. I'll let him talk about that later. But I think Henry's people have even better estimates on how dangerous the Iranian nuclear stockpile is and how close they are to getting a nuclear weapon. So the question remains, how can we possibly be talking about a nuclear agreement with Iran under these circumstances, with the cheating, with the failure to answer questions about their nuclear program, with the enormous concessions we made just to get them to the negotiating table? This doesn't make any sense, but it does make sense. And the reason it makes sense is because there's something you haven't been told. The Obama administration's talks with Iran are based on an assumption they are not revealing. In their desperation to get an agreement with Iran, we are pursuing a policy of containment, not prevention. They have decided that since a nuclear bomb with Iran cannot be avoided, the best we can do is to manage it. In a sense, President Obama has conceded the bomb to Iran. Now, I know many of you may think that that is unfair, but let me point out that this is not an uncommon view among people in the liberal foreign policy establishment. Professor Kenneth Walt, who was a professor at Columbia University, he's deceased now, argued in a July-August 2012 Foreign Affairs article entitled "Why Iran Should Get the Bomb" that fears about an Iranian bomb are unfounded because history shows nuclear weapons stabilize regional tensions by creating a balance of power. Ken Pollack, who is at the Brookings Institution here in Washington, also believes that an Iranian nuclear weapon is not a problem, and said in a September 23, 2013 article in the New York Times that it's extremely unlikely Iran would use nuclear weapons unprovoked to give them to terrorists. Former CIA officer Paul Pillar, who teaches at Georgetown University, believes, and he said this in an March-April Washington Monthly article entitled, "We Can Live with a Nuclear Iran," that an Iranian nuclear weapon would not be an existential threat to Israel and would not give Iran a license to become more of a regional troublemaker. These guys are dead wrong. Iran is a state sponsor of terror. Iran has an al-Qaeda cell operating in Tehran right now. This is a country whose head of state only last week issued a 9-point plan on how to wipe Israel off the map. Now, I present to you, who do you think has the ear of the president and the president's advisors? Are they talking to Jim Phillips and the Heritage Foundation, or AEI, or the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, or the Center for Security Policy? No, they're talking to organizations like Brookings, Georgetown University, and others in the liberal foreign policy establishment who have always downplayed the proliferation risk and think we conservatives are obsessing over the risk of an Iranian nuclear weapon. We're not. This is a serious threat to national security and international security. But let me say that the idea that an Iranian nuclear weapon could be contained, I think can be defended. I think it's dead wrong, but that idea can be defended. But the administration is going beyond simply conceding the bomb to Iran. With all these concessions in the Iranian cheating, they are conceding to Iran an increasing capacity to build multiple nuclear weapons in this agreement. They are conceding the capacity to build multiple nuclear weapons. So what do? We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't have made these concessions last fall. We should not have made the concessions over the last year. Congress must repudiate these talks, state very clearly that sanctions will not be lifted and new sanctions will be passed on Iran until it answers all outstanding questions of the nuclear program. The Center for Security Policy is calling for this, and I think is really the only response to what is a deeply irresponsible policy stemming from the desperation of this administration to put Mr. Obama in the history book as someone who struck a nuclear agreement with Iran. The price is too high. The danger to international security is simply too high. And that's why I'm arguing, the Center for Security Policy is arguing, enough. The American people in Congress have to say to the president, these talks have to stop, go back to the go back to the drawing board, and get an agreement that has a real chance of stopping Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Thank you.
Thanks, Fred. And next speaker is Patrick with, I'm gonna hit his book again.
We're available free on our website. I don't get any royalties. So I'm going to talk a bit about how Iranians are looking at these talks. And on the whole, what we've seen in the last few months in Iran is silence. Not a whole lot of talk about this. And the general theme, even from the usual hardliners who criticize anything that moderates do, has been that our nuclear negotiating team, our Iranian nuclear negotiating team, is demanding that the West respect Iran's rights. And so what they're doing is positioning themselves for saying that if there isn't an agreement, it's because the West wouldn't agree to Iran's very reasonable demands. And so this is, I think, illustrating the strategy that the hardliners in general and the Supreme Leader in particular is taking towards these nuclear talks, which is they want to position themselves in a way that they can win if the talks succeed and they can win if the talks fail. And so their theme has been that Iran's making reasonable demands, and if the West doesn't agree to it, it's because the West is nuts. And meanwhile, the nuclear negotiating team has been remarkably inflexible. Now, my great concern about this midnight deal that you talked about is that in the end, the United States and its allies will agree to rather far-reaching concessions in order to reach a nuclear deal. I suspect that if that happens, that what we will get is a deal which really isn't very much, in which the Iranians don't agree to do very much, and we don't agree to do very much. And that in spite of what I'm sure will be a lot of noise about how this is an historic deal, I suspect the Iranians will not agree to dismantle their nuclear program, and we will not agree to dismantle our sanctions. So that we will get a lot of noise, but actually the deal won't be very much. And that, furthermore, the Supreme Leader, I would argue, is quite likely to allow this deal to go ahead. He did not allow the last deal that we negotiated with Ahmadinejad's guys. Back in 2009, we negotiated a deal called the Tehran Research Reactor Deal, and worked out all the technical specifications. And then in the end, the Supreme Leader said, thumbs down to that deal. But this time, I suspect he's more likely to say what he's been saying about the talks for the last few months. And by the way, this is a guy who speaks an awful lot, and his speeches are really quite good indicators of what he's going to do. And what he's been saying is that I think these talks are a mistake. I don't think that the West is sincere. I don't think that they're going to, in fact, make any concessions. But let's see. Let's give it a try. I don't think it's a good idea, but my team's saying this is what we should do, and so, okay, I'll let it go ahead. And that fits with a strategy that the Supreme Leader has often adopted in situations in which he says, look, my preference would be that we not do this. But my team is telling me we should. And that puts him in a very nice position Because if things work out, he could say, well, I let it go ahead. And if things don't work out, he'd say, see, I told you so. So this is a technique that he likes to use often, is to say, I'm opposed to this deal. I think it's bad deal because it relies upon the West to fulfill its promises, which they won't do. But I'll let it go ahead. And I would suspect that if we get a deal, that what we're going to be faced with is what usually happens when you negotiate a deal with the Iranians, whether it's a business deal or a political deal. You know, the joke that's often told by Iranians is that after an Iranian businessman negotiates a deal with a foreigner and the deal's signed, the foreigner wants to celebrate, the Iranian businessman says, yeah, the deal gives us a good basis for beginning our negotiations. And that's the Iranian approach to these deals, which is to say, once the deal is signed, what we are likely to see is that the implementation of the deal by Iran is going to be polite, incomplete. That Iran is likely to interpret provisions in stunning ways that undermine the content of this, that Iran is likely to engage in ambiguous cheating, and that we are likely to tie ourselves into knots about this. Think of the history of arms control agreements with the Soviet Union, where the most famous one was we signed an agreement with the Soviets about banning biological weapons, and the Soviets decide, aha, the Americans want to ban it, the biological weapons must be something there, and they start up a large program for biological weapons, which they had not previously had. Or you may recall we had the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the ABM Treaty, and the Russians build a very large radar at Krasnoyarsk, which is, they come up with a very convoluted explanation about why that's not cheating on the agreement. Or if you look at in the post-Soviet period, the attitude the Russians have had toward the agreement on the conventional forces in Europe, which is, shall we say, been creative interpretations as to why they should be allowed to do things which are clearly not permitted by the treaty, and then finally walk out of the treaty. And so that's what I would expect that we are likely to see by the Iranians, is ambiguities will be exploited, and the provisions will not be fully implemented. Meanwhile, the Iranians will complain that we're not going to implement our side of the deal either, because the Iranians have created this expectation among their population that the sanctions are going to be lifted. And that's the constant theme that you hear. In return for a nuclear deal, the sanctions will be lifted. Well, not really, for several reasons. First is that the practice that we have had for sanctions in every country, and for good reason, has been that we only lift sanctions as the other side demonstrates that it's implementing a deal. So we don't lift the sanctions just after the deal is signed. We lift the sanctions after there is demonstrated commitment by the other side to follow through on the provisions of the deal. And that will take a while. So that it's unlikely that the provisions, that many of the sanctions will be lifted right away. Even in the best of circumstances, the sanctions will only be lifted over time. Furthermore, as the 328 members of the House, that's a majority of each of the two parties, wrote the president to point out that when the president says that after a deal with Iran, that the nuclear sanctions on Iran will be lifted, there's the minor problem of there are no nuclear sanctions on Iran. That's the exact statement made by the 328 House members. There are sanctions on Iran for a variety of reasons, part of which is nuclear reasons, but part of it also is Iran's state sponsorship of terrorism, and also Iran's terrible human rights records and various other things, drug trafficking and so on. And so, in fact, it's unlikely that there would be a substantial change in U.S. sanctions, many of the U.S. sanctions. Some of them might get lifted, but frankly, many of them will remain. So that is one of my great concerns, is that the Iranians will think that we're not following through on our side of the deal, and therefore why should they follow through on their side of the deal? And their instinct anyway is going to be to implement the deal in partially. But I don't think that will particularly matter very much to the Obama administration. And that is because the Obama administration, for all of its desire to reach a nuclear deal with Iran, has frankly moved on. And their big concern with the Iranians now is less and less the nuclear deal, and is more and more Iranian cooperation and effort against the Islamic State, ISIL. And the president's letter to Khamenei a couple weeks ago was a clear indication of what is becoming an emerging U.S. strategy about how we're going to defeat ISIL. Because we've got a real problem about how to defeat ISIL. And that problem basically is that we don't have any boots on the ground to do this. And in particular, we don't have anybody who's prepared to put boots on the ground to fight against ISIL in Syria, which is where they retreated after they got their butts kicked in Iraq. And effectively, what the U.S. strategy is becoming is that we are cooperating with the Assad regime in order to fight ISIL in Syria. The Assad regime has become our boots on the ground. And much of what the Assad regime's forces that are fighting against ISIL are the Iranian-trained, Iranian-backed, Iranian-equipped militias inside Syria. And many of the others are Shia fighters brought in either from Iraq or from Lebanon. And so that is the heart and core of the battle against ISIL in Syria. And that is basically the administration's strategy for defeating ISIL in Syria. So we are increasingly working with the Iranians. We're working with the deconflicting with the Iranians is the phrase that's used a lot with the administration in Syria and also in Iraq, where in many cases what's happening is the United States is providing the air cover for ground operations which are being conducted partly by the Iraqi security forces, but in larger numbers by these various Shia militias, which the Iranians are trained, and where there are Iranian advisors on the ground. And where the senior Iranian commanders, such as the head of their Quds forces, showed up on a couple of occasions to take credit for his ground forces, which achieved a victory in no small part because of the U.S. airstrikes. So it's a bit of an exaggeration, but the viewpoint which has become quite widespread throughout the Middle East is that the United States is acting as the Iranian Air Force. That the Iranian forces are on the ground and the United States is in the air in the campaign against ISIL. So that is really what the administration is now having constant meetings about. The president goes to a great many meetings of his national security advisors. There are principals committee meetings all the time about this set of issues and not about the Iranian nuclear issue. So the administration has in many ways moved on from the focus on the nuclear issue with Iran to instead seeing Iran as a partner in what the president is describing as this long war against ISIL. And the nuclear deal then becomes part of the way to seal this partnership. So the United States may well be prepared to enter into a nuclear deal, which is only part of what it wants, because that will be an important element in cementing this relationship against ISIL.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. And now batting cleanup is Henry Sokolski.
Well, I can't resist. Do I need to push something here?
No.
No, it should be on.
All right. I was walking over here, looking at various places I used to live. It's been 33 years since I was a visiting fellow here. And I shudder to think, but I think you've been here at least as many years, right?
Yeah, I've been here since the last millennium.
So it's nice to be back. I guess from what we've heard, I think one of the takeaways is that if there's no deal, then Iran and its nuclear activities become treated, at least by the International Atomic Energy Agency in most countries, as if Iran was a legitimate member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and therefore they can enrich, reprocess, do anything they want as long as they declare it. Now, if we have a loose deal, the that might be delayed. But as I think Patrick made a pretty good argument, for several years, but not many years. Maybe, I don't know, how long was the agreed framework? I guess that was a long time. Maybe it'd be less than that, several years. Now, if we have a tough deal, it might still be just several years because it would be difficult to implement. Now, why does that matter? Well, I think we have to actually contemplate future reruns, as unpleasant as that may be. Saudi Arabia has senior officials on record saying, well, whatever they get, we'll demand. We are negotiating an agreement with South Korea, a friend, an ally. They want to make plutonium-based fuels in a process that we have described as reprocessing, which roughly, if you take a few steps out from what they're doing, is called pyro-reprocessing. It's basically very, very similar to our weapons production process. They want to enrich. It's going to be harder, I suppose, to say, well, you're an ally, but Iran isn't. You shouldn't, but they can. Turkey, Japan, Brazil, Egypt, Algeria, in due course. I mean, this is a slow-moving train wreck. It will take many years, but it's a trajectory that is noticeable. I mean, it's avertible, but it's certainly one that's not getting much attention. Now, when you ask the question of how we got here, and we've already been raising that question, I think it's fair to say there are three kinds of causes. And I think they go deeper and further back than it's been described so far. First, of course, is the prime cause, which is Iran's desire and drive to get essentially a bomb option. This drive goes back quite a way without getting all the way back to the Shah. I can remember working in the Pentagon in 1989 and 90 and noticing the traffic with regard to Iran's attempts, secretly I might add, to get a heavy water reactor. It just didn't make sense unless you were interested in a bomb. There's a paper out there, which I'll get to in a moment, which actually talks about this a bit. I tried to raise attention within the Pentagon to this, because I said, well, it looks like another Iraq in the making. By the way, at the time, people forget, we were still sending dual-use items to Saddam. We were still having a problem figuring out whether he was a problem. That leads me to the second problem, or driver, that got us to where we are, and that is there's been a lot of denial in Washington and amongst our friends, and a downplaying of the threat that Iran's nuclear activities pose. And that brings me to this other paper. It's called 10 Regrets. Someone asked me several years ago to write a paper on, well, did we do anything wrong? And I started writing, and at 10, I figured, wait a minute, you got to stop. I could have gone further, but I thought that was, there are always lists of 10, and that's, anything more, and you'd be certified a little unstable if you went further, so I stopped. But the fact of the matter is, right from the get-go, there was a denial that we should stop sending dual-use items to Iran. By the way, this occurred not in the Obama administration. I think it was Bush 1, if I remember correctly, and that's a long time ago. There also was, in the Clinton administration, suppression of information about what the Chinese admitted and told us in private, which is that they had been helping the Iranians set up an enrichment feed facility, and in fact sent feed material, and was helping to build a hexafluoride plant, which is the feed plant for the enrichment plant. We sat on that for a very, very, very long time. I speculate, I don't have proof, it probably had something to do with not wanting to embarrass the Chinese as we were getting ready to cut a nuclear deal and we were going to make billions and billions of dollars in reactor sales. Oh well, that didn't work out at any level. So it goes deeper and longer than just the Obama administration, I'm afraid. What bothers me, though, is it isn't just a kind of weakness about talking about what the problem might be. It's a kind of intellectual lassitude or just, I guess, laziness. We now argue, by the way, actually, literally on the record, that Iran does not have a right to enrich. We may have conceded that they can exercise that right, but actually, if you ask any State Department employee, do they have a clear right to enrich, they will say, well, no, which is interesting. By the way, I think it was someone very senior in the Bush administration on your watch who said, well, of course they have a right, we just want them to exercise it on someone else's soil, Russia. I remember that. But this thing about rights, when you press them, they say, well, the reason they don't have a right is they've done things in the past and they need to rectify the record before we can trust them. Well, okay, but, you know, it looks like we're picking on Iran. I mean, that's how they say it. You see it, and a lot of people in the third world see it. It's not a very deep argument. By the way, I don't think they have a right, but I think the argument rests on something much more principled, and that is they don't have a right, nor do other countries who don't have nuclear weapons have a clear right, because it's not clear that we can inspect these facilities in a fashion that will prevent the possible diversion of these facilities and the materials they make to make bombs. And therefore, it's not clear that they're peaceful. They're too close to bomb making, and therefore, it's not clear that the right to peaceful nuclear energy covers them. Now, if you make that argument, though, there's collateral damage. Your friends, like South Koreans and the Japanese, the Brazilians, are engaged in these activities, and we've said, well, they're good guys. By the way, one of the things you're never supposed to do in government, ever, is to admit that you may have made a mistake. You want to know how we got here? Well, it's like we inherited these policy errors, and now we have to enshrine them. I think that's going to be a problem, because as I argued in front of, I think it was like almost 800 people at the International Atomic Energy Agency just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, technically, there is no way that the IAEA can assure timely detection by its own metrics when it's inspecting facilities such as nuclear fuel-making plants, like enrichment plants and processing plants and hexafluoride plants. And because they cannot find covert facilities reliably, you have to worry that even if there's a large, peaceful light water reactor, they might divert the fresh fuel or the spent fuel to a covert line very quickly, and that if that occurs, we could get caught flat-footed with a country breaking out with a weapon. Now, when I gave that talk, I was told it was beyond politically incorrect by a number of people in the audience. However, the people in the Safeguards Department privately came to me and said, thank you. We need people to say that more clearly. Now, that suggests to me a problem that is, again, resident in a place other than Iran or even the Obama administration, perhaps the IAEA. This leads to 3 modest proposals, which I think are probably all impossible, but they are modest. But it tells you how serious we are if we can't do these things. First, I would suggest, and maybe working backwards, that at the very least, we ought to ask our Congress to ask the executive branch, and I would prefer the intelligence community, to simply identify both publicly and privately what it is the IAEA can and cannot safeguard. In other words, a safeguard is an inspection procedure that allows you to get to detect a diversion early enough that you can intervene from the outside and stop the diversion before it becomes a bomb. And the expectation is so high that that's the case that you deter someone from ever doing it in the first place. Monitoring is inspecting and finding out about that diversion either too late to do anything about it or even after it occurs. It is high time that we make a distinction between inspections that afford safeguarding and inspections that only afford monitoring. And I believe our intelligence community is up to this task. It has never been asked. I served on commissions. The commission always will say, we should do this. Congress has even, in the House, occasionally written this into law and asked for this. It never becomes law. Well, if anybody's serious about verifying any deal or cheating in the case of Iran, you might want to get this done. So that's number one. Number two, assuming any deal is cut, you're going to want to be able to say, well, it only covers Iran. It's not to be followed as a model anywhere else. Please understand this is a one-off. By the way, I encourage people to get into that mode, start doing that dance, and start screaming that scream, particularly if they cut a deal. However, to make that convincing, you would think the United States would feel a little bit more comfortable doing the obvious, and it hasn't been yet. We cut a deal with the United Arab Emirates and with Taiwan most recently that said you cannot, if you want our help on civilian nuclear energy production, reprocess or enrich or get involved in heavy water reactors. And you have to open up your facilities to more intrusive inspections under something called the additional protocol. They agreed. We were going to make that, under the Bush administration, the standard for all agreements. But under the Obama administration, and I will get partisan finally here, we caved. Now, when I say we caved, in all fairness to the administration, there were a lot of people on the other side of the aisle that didn't do the right thing either. Maybe we need to go back and revisit that. What I think at a minimum should be done is that any time an agreement is struck, at least by us, that doesn't meet the standard of the UAE or Taiwan agreement, we should at least put it to a vote. Oh my God, democracy and nuclear power. I didn't know they mixed, but we should force it. Make everyone go on the record. You know, we did not have a vote about the Iran Nuclear Cooperative Agreement, which got this whole thing started. It just went through without a hearing. Well, I'm asking for not just a hearing, but a vote. You know why? No vote, no hearing. You would be amazed how many of these agreements are struck without even a hearing. If you have a vote, there'll be a hearing. That then would lead to the final related point. We need to lean on those we can. That would be the ROK in Japan, who are suppliers of the first order of reactors. They are the ones that own our American Westinghouse and GE when it comes to exports. They get all the proceeds. I don't care where they're registered as headquarters. Therefore, they are the ones that we should be asking to fall in line with our policy, and I believe they will. I don't think that's hard. France, I think, is harder, but not that hard for a variety of reasons. They haven't sold anything since 2007. And in due course, China needs to get things from all of us. And we have leverage. Russia, perhaps now, unlike China, is now the toughest nut. But in time, these things have a way of turning. Every international standard that we have ever reached started here. We need to get started again. That's it.
Thanks, Henry. And that is even more worrisome than I had been led to believe about nuclear proliferation. There's about 5 more panels right in those remarks.
Yeah, but wait a minute. You forgot the most important part of this panel.
What's that?
To the right.
Oh. His book. It's available on his website, actually.
Yes,
Yeah.
free.
And that's at NPEC. We're going to open up for questions. I'm going to ask the first one, and then if we have someone with a microphone, I would just ask you to wait for the microphone, then identify yourself and your affiliation if you have one, and ask a question, not make a long statement. But I'm just going to ask each of our speakers to look in their crystal balls and try to predict what's going to happen by Monday. Is the conventional wisdom correct that the deal is likely just to be kicked down the road with another extension? Will there be some kind of a midnight surprise, or I guess the alternative to that is will the whole thing collapse like a house of cards this weekend, or will it take a lot longer?
I would be very surprised if the whole thing collapsed. I like to point out to people that the Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations began 21 years ago, and they have not been a stunning success in recent years, but no one's prepared to call them off. I don't think anyone's going to call off these talks. The two sides have, at the technical level, quite fully aired the issues involved, explored them in some depth. And so there would be a basis for a last-minute declaration of principles. Now, there wouldn't be a basis for working out a full agreement with all the, but there would be a basis for a last-minute declaration of principles because the two sides are well aware of what are the technical issues, and so they could announce the parameters of a deal. That, however, is not the most likely situation. It's much more likely that what we will see is an announcement of a continuation of the talks for a few months. We could have an interesting discussion about whether or not it would be in the United States' interests for the interim agreement to extend indefinitely. But that's just not politically feasible either here in the United States because of congressional opposition, which will grow over time, or inside Iran, where there would be a lot of opposition because they don't think Iran's getting enough and has accepted too many restrictions in the interim agreement. So the most likely case by far is that there's an extension of the talks, possibly to work out the technical details of a declaration of principles that's done by the weekend, but more likely just a continuation of the talks, pretty straightforward, like what was done in July. And the obvious date is to continue the talks until January 20th, which would be 1 year after the agreement came into the JPOA came into effect.
Okay, Fred?
I think there's incredible pressure on this administration and on the Iranian regime because they're afraid of the Republican Senate. That raises the possibility we could get an agreement by Monday. But I agree with Patrick, the likely outcome, I think, is that the talks will be extended because as unconscionable the concessions we've made to Iran, it looks like the Iranian regime is going to save us from ourselves. They want an even better deal that I frankly don't understand. And I wanted to respond to something that Henry said. He is right that no U.S. official has said that Iran has the right to enrich. However, we have conceded to Iran that they can continue to enrich uranium, and the Russian foreign minister and many other officials have said, you say you haven't conceded the right to enrich.
Right, there you go.
But by telling Iran that you can continue to enrich uranium, you have implicitly conceded the right to enrich.
There you go. We're in violent agreement again.
Okay.
I don't know. Patrick's always very confident, so I always go with Patrick, even when he's wrong. But I like the idea that we're going to come up with something, because my hunch is that President, needs it, and the Iranians, I think, at some level, think they need it. One thing not to underestimate is the power of even a weak president to get his way on these things. We always get that wrong. It's something about no one took constitutional law, in high school or college, but the power of the president here is quite high. So I think Congress will be looking for ways to beat its breast to the extent it's not happy. I'm hoping that they will at least try to find out how well one could keep track of things. And I suspect there may be some interest in that, but the jury's out. We'll see.
Okay, and with that, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. If you could just raise your hand, wait for someone to bring, do we have a, oh yeah, we do have a mic. Oh, yes. Hi, Michelle.
Thanks. Michelle Cordero. I actually work at Heritage. I'm with Broadcast Services. But Jim, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more. You mentioned perhaps a midnight surprise. A little curious as to what you think that would entail.
Well, I agree that I think the Obama administration is under tremendous pressure to come up with something to at least provide the illusion of progress in these negotiations. So if I had to guess, I would say they may be hoping for a final agreement, but would settle for some kind of framework that could be argued as an advance. But I think a lot of people in Congress are going to be looking very closely at the details of what further concessions has Iran made just to get an extension. What prospects are there going to be for actually nailing it down in the future? And I think the longer, in my opinion, I think Iran is interested in a negotiating process, but not in a final agreement that would require it to sacrifice a nuclear option. But it figures as long as the negotiations are going, it gets substantial sanctions relief. It buys time to undermine sanctions already. We see Russia circling with possible oil deals, and China has stepped up oil imports from Iran in the spring, and over time that sanctions regime, which I think brought Iran to the table, will be further weakened to the point where it won't give the U.S. enough leverage to get the kind of deal that we would need in the long run.
If there's a midnight surprise, I will bet you, any odds you care to choose, that there's less to it than meets the eye. The two sides will greatly exaggerate whatever they agree to.
And that brings up something to me. Many people have argued that the administration, in entering this negotiation, sacrificed so much bargaining leverage just to get Iran to the table that we don't have enough leverage to get the kind of deal we need in terms of sanctions. So what, if any, kind of sanctions ratcheting up could the U.S. do to increase that leverage?
Look, the leverage that we have over Iran is partly due to sanctions. But people, that's not likely to be sufficient to make Iran decide to fundamentally change its foreign policy orientation.
Well, it didn't stop North Korea.
It doesn't stop anybody. I mean, look, countries do not, Mr. Gaddafi seems to have decided to made a change in his foreign policy orientation, in part because of sanctions. That's the most I can think of. But in other cases, it's that the pressure that's going to lead a country to make a change in its basic foreign policy orientation is much more likely to be the prospect of military confrontation. And so if what we need to do is to get Iran to take a path that it doesn't want to take, it's unlikely that sanctions can accomplish that. The administration is banking on the idea that there is a vigorous debate inside Iran about what Iran's orientation should be. And the Obama team is highly confident that there are people inside Iran, including the current president and foreign minister, who want to, in the phrase the Obama team likes to use, join the 21st century and become part of the world. And that what we have to do is find ways to empower those people to show that, in fact, that's going to be much more successful for Iran for accomplishing its own objectives. And so that's what they see the sanctions as doing, is empowering those inside Iran who want to see Iran take a different direction. Right? That's shall we say, an optimistic view. That's a very optimistic view. And I don't see a whole lot of indications that the Iranian team agrees with. And that when I take a look at what Mr. Rouhani has written about his past negotiations, and by the way, he wrote a big fat book about his role in the past negotiations, which tells you what happened every morning and every afternoon during each talk. Right? So any idea that Iran is a country that's hard to read is just nonsense. I mean, Iranians write amazing amounts of very detailed stuff about what goes on in secret negotiations. And what he describes is that it's possible for Iran to accomplish what it wants to do by being cooperative rather than being confrontational. So his approach is to say that by Iran smiling rather than snarling, it'll get what it wants. Iran, the way I would put it, is that Rouhani's viewpoint is that Iran gets more by blowing smoke in your eyes than by spitting in your eyes. And so that's his view of what can be accomplished in negotiations, much more than the administration view that there's this team in Iran that's interested in joining the modern world, joining the 21st century. And so the idea that what we're going to be able to do by additional sanctions is persuade Iran to make a fundamental change in its foreign policy objectives, I find very optimistic, just very optimistic. And I see, frankly, very little prospect that we are going to persuade Iranian leaders that there's a realistic threat to the use of military force. Now, Obama disagrees. The most interesting thing to me about the Jeffrey Goldberg interview in Bloomberg with Obama was when Jeffrey asks Obama this question about, well, do you, after what you did about Syria, do you think the Iranian leaders think that, in fact, if they got a bomb, that the United States would use military force? And I urge you to go back and look at that exchange because the president cuts Goldberg off, not once, but twice, saying, of course, all Iranian leaders understand that I would use military force in the event of Iran proceeding towards bomb. And Goldberg says, you really think that the Iranian leaders believe that? Obama says, absolutely, of course, they all understand that. Now, I would love to know who in the intelligence community provided that judgment to the president. I have my doubts. I suspect that that's the president's own reading of things. But it's precisely because he thinks that the Iranian leaders understand this, that he thinks that we're going to be able to have the leverage to bring them to an agreement, that they understand the threat and they understand the opportunity. And I just think that's a very optimistic reading. I don't think that they see the opportunity the same way that he does, and I don't think that they see the threat the same way as he does. And I just think that any idea that we're going to be able, through an additional set of sanctions, to change their calculus is also very optimistic.
I would add just some little qualification that might make the point even firmer. I don't think it's the use of force, if you take a look at the countries that have given up nuclear weapons, that's been the great lever. My own personal experience with Argentina, Brazil, South Africa, and Ukraine suggests that at least as often as anything like that, domestic demand to make changes because, well, there's a transition to a form of rule where it becomes risky to hold on to these things is part of it. In the case of Taiwan and South Korea, it was the loss of security assurances, not the threat of attack, that seemed to be very important. So that only highlights, though, the basic points Patrick's making is correct, that the idea that you can sanction your way out of your proliferation problem is not a complete thought. It may be that you, and I've always argued for sanctions because it at least puts this activity in a pejorative context, and so that's useful. And it gives you something to give them when behavior changes. But the idea that it would force behavior, I think Patrick, is right. There's not much that's all that clear that suggests that's the case.
But I think a better argument for this additional sanctions on Iran is you want to persuade other countries not to go down that route.
Right, there you go.
That's a better argument.
Right.
Is to say, you want to say to other countries, listen, do you really want to go down that,
Look what you'll suffer.
look what you'll suffer.
Yeah, no, and that's
So
the reason
you-
I'm generally supportive of it.
Right, because you're not likely to change the Iranians' minds, but there's a good chance that you can influence somebody else's calculations about whether or not they want to do that. I mean, there are relatively few countries in the world that want to emulate North Korea's experience. All right? And that's what we should be
Right.
aiming at.
So the others might see, as they say.
Right. Right.
Okay, any questions? Any other questions here? Well, then let me just go back to that then, because I agree that given the back and forth and the half-hearted consideration of the use of force in Syria, the president zigging and zagging, saying he's going to bomb, then punting it to Congress, then backing off and letting Putin ride in and set up a diplomatic agreement that, by the way, hasn't gotten rid of all Syria's chemical weapons. Syria still is using chlorine gas, which wasn't included in the agreement. It still is believed to have chemical weapons facilities. But given that, I don't think the Iranians are that nervous about President Obama launching a military strike. But how about the situation in 2002, 2003, after the intervention in Iraq, when Colonel Gaddafi gave up his WMD programs and told Italian Prime Minister Berlusconi that he did it out of fear that the Bush administration had him on a list and he was next. I mean, not only did he do that, but also perhaps not so coincidentally, in 2003 is when Iran ended some of its suspect, or is according to a very controversial CIA report, ended some of its nuclear activities, perhaps also out of fear of a U.S. Attack. So, maybe the next administration would be in a better position to not just say that the military option is on the table, but say, and we will actually use it if push comes to shove.
I think the point about Gaddafi is a very important one, and it goes to something Patrick said. The Iranian regime has no fear of this administration. They know there's not going to be an attack by our troops. They know there's no possibility of that. They know this administration is desperate for a deal. They have been driving this deal since the president came into power. So, I mean, I completely agree with Patrick, but there's something on which I don't know. I may disagree a little with you, Patrick, concerning Syria, and I think this is important. I'm very troubled that we have somehow mixed the negotiations on a nuclear agreement with what's going on in Syria and Iraq and ISIS. I just find this inconceivable. Patrick seems to think this has gone further than I do. I'm not sure the administration has a coherent policy on how Iran would be working with us on Syria and Iraq. But assuming Patrick is correct, getting Iran more involved in Iraq is going to drive the ISIS threat, because, the ISIS has come to power and has become so powerful because of the actions of the Maliki regime, which was supported by Iran. Getting Iran more involved in Iraq is going to make the ISIS crisis worse. So the idea that we're talking to Iran about how they can cooperate against ISIS is exactly the wrong thing we should be doing. The only thing we should tell Iran about ISIS is stop meddling in Iraq. I think Patrick's right that we may be collaborating, at least indirectly, with the Assad regime to attack ISIS in Syria. I think that's unavoidable. This was the least of two bad choices. And concerning Iraq CW, isn't it interesting that we made an agreement, Syria CW, we made an agreement that all of the chemical weapons had to come out and the facilities had to be disabled. Maybe that's a good precedent for a policy to get rid of weapons of mass destruction. In Iran, centrifuges aren't being disabled. Enriched uranium stockpiles aren't being removed. At a minimum, why aren't we using the same model for Iran that we used for Syria's chemical weapons program?
Time
If I
for-
may, quick comment. Look, I was outlining what U.S. policy is. I was not endorsing it.
Oh, no, I know that.
I mean, look, I think
I
that's
know that.
a remarkably reading of events to think that working with Iran is going to help you defeat ISIL. Because, as you said, that in fact the rise of ISIL is overwhelmingly because people fear, Sunni Arabs think that this is the only force that's going to protect them against these Shiite extremists. And I mean, I've had any number of Syrians and Iraqis tell me that I despise ISIL, but on the other hand, they're going to keep my family alive, and so therefore I have to work with them. And so Iran is, in fact, by supporting the worst sectarian elements, both in Syria and Iraq, is the chief recruiting sergeant for ISIL. So it's a remarkably stupid strategy, but this is the strategy this administration has adopted. And by the way, it's not that Iran's not afraid of this administration. Iran's not afraid of the United States, because Iran's reading is that the United States has lost repeatedly wars in the Middle East, and that the United States doesn't know how to fight in the Middle East, and that therefore that Iran has cracked the nut on how to defeat the United States and its way of war, which it thinks that is also the way of war that Israel uses, and that therefore they don't have to worry about us, because they know how to defeat us. Now, I think that that's a remarkable reading. It's not right. But unfortunately, when your enemy thinks that it knows how to defeat you, you got a problem. And that's the problem we face at the moment.
We have time for one more question. This man right here.
Hi, Connor Ryan. I'm an intern with Senator Kirk's office. You guys paint a pretty gloomy picture, but I want to know, who are our friends? So you look to Iran, you guys don't think Iran's a friend. You look to ISIS, ISIS isn't a friend. Assad's not our friend. I mean, who are we working with here? I mean, it looks like we're kind of in opposition to the entire Middle East, which in an area which has so many ethnic and religious sectarian groups fighting each other. When we're fighting all of them all at once, there isn't really clearly a strategy there either. So we have a lot of enemies. Who are our friends in those countries?
Look, we got a lot of friends. Frankly, it's the Gulf Arabs and the Israelis. And they see eye to eye. I mean, we've done a remarkable thing. We've managed to...
in those countries.
Look, we've done a remarkable thing of driving together the Gulf Arabs and the Israelis. So, frankly, what you have at the moment is a situation in which Jerusalem, Riyadh, and Abu Dhabi agree with each other more than any of them agree with the United States about the fundamental realities in the region. And there are lots of people in Iran who are sympathetic to the United States and sympathetic to U.S. interests. They're not in power. They're not in power. And so don't count on them in making Iranian government policy. Ain't going to happen. Ain't going to happen. And similarly, in the situation in Syria, what's happened is, surprise, surprise, is that as the conflict has continued, that the radical forces have driven out the moderates. Moderates have left the country. 4 million people left. Who do you think they were? People who were not going to engage in suicide bombing and not going to engage in ethnic slaughter. So the ones that are left are pretty terrible elements. And the only way in which people can stay alive is seeking the protection of one of these terrible elements. So by our not stepping forward to help moderate forces in Syria, we've helped guarantee that the situation is bad. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse.
I agree with Patrick. We did a great thing in putting together an alliance of Gulf states to fight against ISIS. But I got to tell you, many of our friends in the Middle East, Israel and the Saudis, for example, and the UAE, they're very upset about the negotiations, the nuclear negotiations with Iran. And this could cause a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. This could cause the Saudis to try to acquire nuclear weapons, maybe buying them from Pakistan. These are our friends. And let's stipulate that when we made this agreement last fall, we didn't tell the Saudis and the Israelis what we were doing. We made a terrible deal, and we didn't tell our friends what we were going to do. I mean...
When we wrote Khamenei, we didn't tell them we did it.
The Saudis and the Israelis are beside themselves on what's going to come out of these talks. I mean, I can't underestimate how destabilizing this will be to the region. It's a serious mistake. That's why the Center for Security Policy is saying that Congress has to repudiate the talks and this deal and force the administration to start over.
Actually, I thought this was the most interesting question. I don't know how to answer it. Keep asking it.
Yeah, it seems like we have a lot of frenemies in the Middle East, but I would add to your list of friends, I would add Jordan, and on certain issues, Turkey, when it comes to, and Egypt. But, you know, it's not the Middle East of your grandfather's day, that's for sure. And with that gloomy note, let me ask you to join me in thanking the panel for a very illuminating discussion.